Hey up everyone, in today's video we're going to be talking about the best UFC fighters to never win a UFC title. And if I have missed out on any fighters that you think should be included in this list, let me know in the comments because I'm aware there's going to be some that I'm missing in this list. Now let's start off with Tony Ferguson. Yes, I'm very aware he's on an 8-fight losing streak, but before this losing streak started, he was on a 12-fight winning streak and was scheduled to fight Khabib several times. This was meant to happen for the title. I think he did actually have the interim title as well, but he never was able to say he was an actual UFC champion, unfortunately. He never got to say that, and it's such a shame because he definitely should have. He never got to prove himself on the big stage. He was never able to prove himself against Conor McGregor when he was champion because he was fucking about with Floyd Mayweather in the boxing. And again, it was tried to be scheduled several times against Khabib, and it was never made. I do actually think Khabib would have beat him, but regardless, he may have had a chance against Conor. He obviously had a chance against Khabib as well. We never got to see that fight play out. And it's just a massive shame because he was such a good fighter on his day. Stylistically, yeah, I think some of these guys would have beat him, but regardless, we'll never be able to say we definitely know this because the fight's never happened. It's just such a shame because Prime Tony brought so much entertainment, so much, just chaos to the octagon. It's a shame we never got to see him hold that title, and it's an even bigger shame we now have to see him on this massive losing streak and still not retire yet. After this, we have a big fan favourite, the nicest guy in the UFC, and that is Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Yes, he keeps on losing nowadays, but he is 41. He is at the end of his career, but there was a time where this guy was beating everyone. I think he only lost to Matt Brown, and I can't remember what his record was going in against Tyron Woodley, but he only had one loss on his record. And in those fights against Tyron Woodley, he had a draw and he had a loss, and they were both very, very close. In that second fight, not much was happening, but then he suffered the same thing he did in the first fight, where he just got dropped badly, and Woodley got the win, and arguably he should have won those fights. I can't remember how close they actually were. It's been like 7-8 years since these fights happened, but he had some decent wins over the likes of Robert Whittaker. That win aged really nicely as Whittaker's doing really great in the middleweight division, and he also had a great win against Rory McDonald that a lot of people forget about. Rory McDonald was another great talent, and Wonderboy Thompson had a great victory over him. He had a loss over Darren Till, where he arguably should have won that fight as well. And then towards the end of his career, it was only really losing to grapplers, Shavkat, Gilbert Burns, Bilal Muhammad, but when he fought people who would stand and strike, he would beat them. Vicente Luque, Jorge Masvidal, Jeff Neal, Kevin Holland. There was multiple strikers he could beat. The only real one who beat him on the feet was Anthony Pettis. Some people class it as a fluke, I don't. But regardless, I think 9 times out of 10 he would beat Anthony Pettis. But I'd definitely say this is one of the better fighters to never win a title in the UFC. After this, we have Joey B, Joseph Benavidez. And I feel sorry for Joseph Benavidez because he was a very well-rounded MMA fighter, and he was beating everyone, but then we have a few losses on his record, which we will go over. He has the 2 losses to Demetrius Johnson. No shame in that. Demetrius Johnson, one of the greatest fighters of all time. Very unfortunate to have DJ in that weight division at that time, and Joseph Benavidez was in his prime. He has a win over Henry Cejudo. He has a very close loss to Sergio Pettis, which he arguably should have won. And then he just went on to become pretty much too old for the flyweight division. He suffered 2 losses to Figueiredo, but he was a bit at the end of his career. Askar Askarov as well. But Joseph Benavidez on his day was a great fighter and was one of the better flyweights in that division. And just a quick honourable mention for another flyweight, and that's John Dodson. He has a win over TJ Dillashaw. He lost to Demetrius Johnson, and then his other losses really came when he moved up to the bantamweight division. But as a flyweight, John Dodson was really, really good, and I feel like he just deserves an honourable mention. We then move on to Anthony Johnson, and this guy was one of my favourite fighters. He's obviously passed away in 2022, so rest in peace, Anthony Johnson. This one really does upset me because I really did like Anthony Johnson, and on his day, he was just so scary. One of my dream fights would have been Anthony Johnson versus Alex Pereira, or when he teased a comeback, him against Francis Ngannou in the heavyweight division, another one, but unfortunately we were never able to get those scenarios. But Anthony Johnson in his prime, oh my god, this guy was so scary. Knocked out Glover Teixeira in about, 13 seconds was it, with a brutal uppercut. He knocked out Alexander Gustafsson in his home country of Sweden in the first round as well. Got a win over the likes of Phil Davis, who was meant to be an up-and-coming next big thing. A win over Ryan Bader in the first round. And his main losses came to Daniel Cormier twice. And it's just a shame, I think he was just so scary. He was scheduled to fight John Jones. Unfortunately, we never got to see that fight as well. He had to go down in the welterweight divisions. He was in a heavyweight division as well. He was in multiple divisions. But in his prime, it was a light heavyweight division. And we never got to see Anthony Johnson win that light heavyweight title. Given that we just spoke about a light heavyweight and Anthony Johnson, we've got to talk about Alexander Gustafsson. A lot of people talk about this guy being one of the greatest fighters to never win a title. And I completely agree. He had a very close fight against John Jones. Yes, he lost to Anthony Rumble Johnson. No shame there. I think there maybe was a clash of heads. I don't know. It's a bit of a weird angle. But again, that was a big shame for him. He has that unreal performance against Glover Teixeira. I actually think that's one of my favourite performances of all time. Definitely one of my favourite finishing sequences of all time, where he lands like 2 or 3 uppercuts in a row, pivots, and finishes off Glover Teixeira. That was an absolutely masterclass of a performance against Glover Teixeira, which aged really well considering that Glover went on to win the title later on in his career. He also has a close loss against Daniel Cormier, where he was so close to finishing Daniel Cormier, and then he came back to the UFC. He came back and it never really went his way. I don't think his heart was truly in it. He just didn't have much to do. And it's such a shame we never got to see this guy win a title. Again, he was the first person to ever really come close to beating John Jones. He was the first person to cut John Jones, the first person to take him down in an absolute great fight, and got that dog out of John Jones and was the first person to do so. We then moved down to the middleweight division, where we have Jacare Souza. And I actually feel sorry for Jacare Souza because he did lose a few close fights where he could have arguably got the nod. First, we start off with a prime Luke Rockhold. I believe this was in Strikeforce, 5 rounds, and he arguably should have got the nod in a close competitive fight against prime Luke Rockhold. Again, prime Luke Rockhold was no joke, was very, very good. We also have a close split decision loss against Yoel Romero, when he should have arguably got the nod, against Calvin Gastelum, where he arguably should have got the nod, and unfortunately, it just didn't go his way. He also has some wins over a middleweight Robbie Lawler, Derek Brunson twice. He obviously knocked out Weidman in an absolute classic. And then after 2018, when he was about 39 years old, his career just kind of fizzled out and he was eating a few losses to like Kevin Holland, Andre Muniz, stuff like that. But he was just way too old at this point. But he had a very good career, and it's such a shame we never got to see him compete for UFC gold. We then have to move on to another middleweight fighter, and it's the Cuban man himself, Yoel Romero. Hey Mike, I love you, man. Yeah, shit impression, I'm sorry. But he finished for the likes of Brunson, Tim Kennedy. I know there was a lot of controversy with that fight. He finished Machida when he was a bit older, to be fair. Chris Weidman with that flying knee, that infamous flying knee. Luke Rockhold as well with that overhand. And then he had close losses to Robert Whittaker twice, where he arguably should have won. Paulo Costa, another close fight, he arguably should have won. And I don't think this was that close, but some people consider it a robbery, which I disagree with. But also Israel Adesanya in an absolute stinker of a fight where nothing really happened. It was just Israel Adesanya leg kicking Yoel Romero, and that was about it. But Yoel Romero was a freak of nature, was fighting. He's still fighting to this day. Yeah, he's taken a few more losses. He's not the guy he used to be, but a freak of nature. Very scary guy. No one was really calling out Yoel Romero. He had that close fight against Jacare Souza, where he did get the win, but he arguably should have gone to Jacare, but that's still a good win to have on your record. Scary, scary bloke. No one was calling out Yoel Romero. We're then going to move on to one of the most violent men in the UFC, and that is Justin Gaethje. This guy has stupid power in his hands. Finished for the likes of Edson Barboza, Donald Cerrone, broke the infamous 12-fight winning streak of Tony Ferguson. He also had a great fight against Michael Chandler, one of my favourite fights of all time. He got a win over Dustin Poirier, and he got a win over Rafael Fiziev. He also has a few losses in there, but all of his losses are against absolute elite fighters. Dustin Poirier, Eddie Alvarez is a bit hit and miss, but this was before Justin Gaethje, I feel like, really started to smarten up when it came to his fighting style. But he has a loss against Eddie Alvarez, which again was very entertaining. He lost to Khabib, he lost to Max Holloway, and he lost to Charles Oliveira. But there's no shame in any of those losses, in my opinion. He learned a lot from that Eddie Alvarez fight, and I feel like the second coming of Justin Gaethje would have actually beat Eddie Alvarez quite comfortably. But yeah, this guy definitely was not far off from winning a title. Only lost to elite guys. So entertaining. I don't know what else I can say about this guy. Feel like his win over Fiziev is quite underrated and will age quite well. I think Fiziev was also a favourite as well. That was a great fight. Always in great fights. definitely is one of the greatest fighters to never win a UFC title. And then we move on to Dustin Poirier. Again, has a win over Justin Gaethje, has a loss against Justin Gaethje. I'd like to see them both have a trilogy and both of them just retire after that trilogy, regardless of who wins and who loses. I think it'll be the perfect way for both of these men to retire. Has wins over Max Holloway twice, wins over Conor McGregor twice, even though one of them was via leg break. You know, has multiple good wins. And Dustin Poirier, how can you not like him? Also has wins over Benoit Saint Denis, has his title losses against Khabib, against Islam Makhachev, against Charles Oliveira. Unfortunately, he just lost when it came to those fights. He has won an interim title, but again, we're not going to include interim titles as it doesn't really count, and the fighters themselves don't really class that as a legit title win. But Dustin Poirier, one of the best lightweights to ever do it, in my opinion, one of the greatest to never win an actual title. And then the final fighter who is a part of this list is Alistair Overeem, probably my favourite heavyweight of all time. Had such a long career, and I think he was doing MMA for like 20, 30 odd years. Fought the who's who of every division. He was in the middleweight division, like heavyweight division, the heavyweight division. Got wins over Vitor Belfort twice when Vitor was in his prime. He's got 3 wins over Fabricio Werdum, which is absolutely fucking crazy. He obviously beat Brock Lesnar, what kind of put Alistair Overeem on a map to an extent. You got Junior Dos Santos in a somewhat of a controversial finish from what I remember. You also have Frank Mir, but when he was a bit older. You have Mark Hunt twice. And then at the end of his career, even though he lost a few times, he also had a win against Sergey Pavlovich, which has aged really well in my opinion. He's obviously got his losses to Stipe Miocic, Travis Brown, Antonio Bigfoot Silva in the UFC, and you obviously have multiple losses to the likes of like Chuck Liddell, Mauricio Shogun Rua. But this guy's been about for so long, of course he's going to pick up big victories and big losses. But he won a title. I think what makes it so upsetting for me is that he won a title everywhere besides the UFC, and I think that's what hurts me so much. He won it everywhere, but he just couldn't win it in the UFC. And even in his one title shot against Stipe Miocic, he was able to drop Stipe, but his fight IQ just wasn't the best, and he went for a submission, and he thought he got a tap, the infamous video, but he just didn't get it, and unfortunately he lost to Stipe in the first round. And we never got to see him win win a title in every single organization that he was a part of, because he wasn't able to get it done in the UFC. Even when he was able to make somewhat of a resurgence later on in his career, you know, when he would beat the likes of Walt Harris and Augusto Sakai and Sergey Pavlovich, at the end he lost to Volkov. It just didn't go well for the guy. And those are the fighters I consider to be the greatest fighters to never win a UFC title. Let me know in the comments if I've missed out on anyone. If you agree with some of these fighters that I have picked, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.